Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. And now we will have Ms. Sarah Houston of the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. Ms. Houston.
Thank you. Our next section covers education and policy of medical cannabis in communities of color. As I think about medical cannabis, I am struck by the complexity of the topic, by its far reach and interdisciplinary implications, and how much information really must be taken into account when we begin to think about education and policy. As has already been raised in the first section, and as I anticipate our expert panel in this section will address further, cannabis has a complex history, especially for communities of color, and that background complicates effective discussion around this topic. Those complications are also what ties these two elements together so closely, education and policy, and makes discussions like this one the crux to the future of cannabis as a therapeutic tool. I'm excited to introduce our three speakers in this section, Dr. Rachel Knox, Mr. Stanley Atkins, and Ms. Jessica Gonzalez. First, we're delighted to have Dr. Rachel Knox. Dr. Knox is a certified cannabinoid medicine specialist and clinical endocannabinologist with a background in family, integrative, and functional medicine. She is a policy and regulatory consultant and a leader in the area of cannabis and health equity. She is co-founder and chair of the Association for Cannabis Health Equity in Medicine, co-founder and president of the Cannabis Health Equity Movement, and co-founder of Doctors Knox Incorporated and American Cannabinoid Clinics. Dr. Knox also serves in leadership of many professional organizations, including serving as chair of the Oregon Cannabis Commission and as a member of the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine, among others. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Knox.
Wonderful. All right, so in kicking us off here, I will do my best to quickly introduce the work that I do in cannabis education and policy, followed by a very high-level overview of the complex idea that is cannabis health equity. And my hope is to demonstrate why health equity education and policy reform are prerequisite to adequately, optimally, and holistically caring for our 65 plus population, especially those of color with cannabis, but also to bring some perspective around cannabis in a broader way. Right. So as Sarah shared, my medical background is in family, integrative, and functional medicine. And I'm one of 4 doctors in my family who've all pivoted away from conventional medicine into cannabinology and endocannabinology. And together we founded the American Cannabinoid Clinics, where we practice functional cannabinoid medicine. And we've committed our lives' work to establishing this field as a recognized board subspecialty one day. We've also founded Pivotal EDU to help educate our healthcare peers, and are really excited to share that we'll be co-developing a master's in endocannabinology curriculum this year. Now, our team is rounded out by my big brother, who my mom likes to call our out lawyer, being the only attorney in the family, and also his wife, who bring over 15 years of legal, regulatory, business, and equity consulting experience in cannabis. Zach is the former vice chair of the Oakland Cannabis Commission, and LaWanda runs the technical assistance to Oakland, Fresno, and San Francisco social equity programs through her cannabis consulting firm. Like my brother and sister-in-law, I too have been involved in cannabis policy and regulation going on 5 years, and I'm entering my 3rd as the chair of our Oregon Cannabis Commission. But I'm also a proud board member of Minority Cannabis Business Association and Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. I'm a member of Portland's Cannabis Policy Oversight Team, you get the theme here, and I'm a founding member of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. And I can tell you, it is so important for medical professional advocates to be involved in cannabis policy oversight. It matters so much. Now, before I get into the heart of my segment, I want to review a few terms emerging from the medical cannabis space. I dropped a few last slide. First, we have cannabinology, which means the study of the uses, effects, and modes of action of cannabinoids and cannabimimetic substances. And next, we have endocannabinology, which is the study of the endogenous cannabinoid system, including its function and dysfunction and modulation by cannabinoids and cannabimimetic modalities. And real quick, in the wake of cannabis legalization, it really is our due diligence to be teaching this in medical schools, right? There's still much to learn, but we know enough to begin preparing students for both the present and future they are walking into. And then finally here we have functional, and sometimes we say integrative cannabinoid medicine. So this is the type of medicine my family practices, which is really the clinical application of cannabinology and endocannabinology, but also ecology to patient care to correct endocannabinoid system dysfunction at its root causes. And typically it's done in a way that is integrated with other natural and conventional regimens. So I normally like to begin talks on cannabis health equity with a detailed cannabis history lesson ending with the discovery of this system, the endocannabinoid system, and the ongoing research that's really uncovering a much bigger endocannabinoid dome. So what I will briefly review, though, is that the endocannabinoid system is a 600 million-year-old signaling system, lipid signaling system, made up of endogenous cannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors that is common to all animals except the insect. And its primary role is to maintain physiological order in and across all organ systems. So from conception to death, there is not a single physiological function or process that is not in some way modulated by this system. And it's not only reactive to internal stimuli, but external stimuli as well, managing appetite, memory, mood, sleep, stress, and other protective mechanisms. And so this ECS is constantly adapting and reacting to our external environment. And this is why it's important to understand the role of ecology and how that plays at its core, right? So to set the context for the rest of my talk, I want to quickly shift gears for just a moment to talk about ecological sustainability as it intersects with the ECS and the sustainability of health. So generally speaking, ecological sustainability is best explained by the famous ecologist Robert Goodland. And he describes sustainability as the sum of four pillars: economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, human sustainability, and social sustainability. And he articulates that sustainability is not only the prevention of ecological harm or the avoidance of depleting natural resources, but also maintenance, right, which requires capital investment. So investment in human capital, in our education, our skill development, our knowledge and leadership, as well as the physical, mental, and spiritual fitness of us as human beings. Investment in environmental capital and preserving clean water, land, air, forests, and mineral-dense soils so we can grow healthy foods. Investment in economic capital, right, in maintaining the value of currency and its fair distribution across a society. And investment in social capital, right, in the infrastructures and systems required to establish and maintain the basic framework for society. And if any one of these pillars is lacking, the balance of the ecological sustainability becomes compromised. But what does the current state of human health suggest about our commitment to sustainability? 1 in 10 American adults is suffering from heart disease or cancer, 1 in 5 from chronic pain, fibromyalgia, depression, anxiety, PTSD, or IBS, 1 in 3 from insomnia, high blood pressure, or prediabetes, 1 in 2 from chronic headaches, and 1 in 1.5 from some form of chronic stress. And ongoing research is suggesting that eventually all illnesses may be traced back to some sort of ECS dysfunction. Our leading causes of disease reflect an ecological problem in that they are caused by the products and services and circumstances that our politics and industrial complexes create and perpetuate, right, in a race against our own nature and towards profits, right? The state of our health is a reflection of our ecosystem, which is really a reflection of our priorities, and it's inextricably tied to ecological sustainability. So here are those stats at a glance. And those stats are why understanding endocannabinoid system dysfunction matters, right? All humans have what we call an underlying endocannabinoid tone, and that's a reflection of the levels of endocannabinoids, their production, their metabolism, and the relative abundance of cannabinoid receptors. And this natural tone can be disturbed, right? And several of our most troublesome chronic illnesses today have been associated with ECS dysfunction, whether it's an excess of endocannabinoids or receptors or a deficiency. And you might recognize here that a number of classical endocannabinoid deficiency syndromes reside among our leading causes of morbidity and mortality, such as mental illness, chiefly PTSD as listed here, IBS and migraine headaches, and also diseases of ECS hyperactivity like cancer and diabetes. All right, and for our vulnerable Black community specifically, these stats are even worse, right? Black adults are 1.2 times more likely to die from cancer, 1.3 times more likely to be obese, a major risk factor for diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and other metabolic disorders, 1.5 times more likely to develop high blood pressure, a leading cause of heart disease and stroke, 1.6 times more likely to develop diabetes and 2.1 times more likely to die from it, and 1.2 times more likely to develop asthma and 2.8 times more likely to die from it. Right? Regarding mental health, Black adults are actually more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than white adults. And Black youth are more likely to attempt suicide than white youth. We had Healthy People 2010 and 2020, and they had audacious goals to close the minority health disparity gap. But COVID-19, I think, has made it strikingly apparent that we have just not invested in the health and well-being of the Black community, nor in other marginalized and vulnerable populations. And the picture that I'm beginning to paint here is this, right? Our communities are suffering from conditions representative of ECS dysfunction, and research has long established that cannabis preparations, cannabinoids, and cannabimimetics may be effective in treating them. But before we delve into the treatment of ECS dysfunction with cannabis, we have to ask ourselves one fundamental question, right? That's the functional doctor in me. How did we get here, right? What is the root cause? And the answer is far too nuanced than we have the time to untangle here, but I like to call out one critical yet severely overlooked arc. Okay. And again, it comes down to ecology, or rather socioecology. We have to understand the degree to which the war on drugs paved way to racial health disparity. Once a highly valued American cash crop grown by enslaved people, cannabis was weaponized against communities of color. And just 6 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we saw the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, which ushered in an era of disproportionate enforcement and prohibition laws in Black communities, a process that imprisoned breadwinners and heads of households and contributed to the multi-generational marginalization and disinvestment in our communities that has negatively impacted all determinants of well-being, right? In other words, it has fueled poverty. This is the landscape of health disparity, and cannabis prohibition has played a major role in defining not only it, but our 65-plusers' relationship with it, right? And as a result, caring for our vulnerable populations with cannabis has to be about even more than just the medicine. And it's because health is not created or maintained through our medical systems or by medical care alone, right? Health, good or poor, is the net result of the 4 determinants of well-being as listed here: economic determinants, environmental determinants, human and social determinants. And these determinants should remind you of the 4 pillars of sustainability because they are nearly synonymous with them. And where even one of these is lacking, health cannot be optimized. So medical solutions, even cannabis ones alone, cannot optimally treat our aging and vulnerable populations. And this schematic is why. If we want our communities to be healthy and if we want to truly serve our aging population, we have to start thinking about how we heal and demand healing very differently. We have to demand equitable access to well-being, right? Which is created and maintained by the fair distribution of attention and investment across the 4 determinants of well-being. Through systemic racism and the ongoing war on drugs, Black and other impacted communities have been denied all of this. And this is why cannabis education and policy, especially as they pertain to decriminalization, legalization, research, innovations, and also the regulation of its commercial economy, need to be what we call health equity centered. We have to ask ourselves, based on everything that cannabis can do and extends well beyond medical use, what do we want to know and what do we want to achieve? And that is what cannabis health equity is all about. We've coined this term because we really want to drive this point home. Cannabis health equity is the leverage of the economy, taxation, and total utility of all cannabis innovations to achieve health equity. And it's become a movement founded by a coalition of Black leaders in cannabis to educate, advocate, and demonstrate that cannabis is a root solution to achieving health equity for all people. And our mission is to actualize health equity for all people, beginning with the revitalization of the communities most harmed by the war on drugs. Through applying regenerative design to industrial cannabis ecosystems, CHEM aims to leverage the agricultural, industrial, medical, and nutritional innovations of cannabis to revivify our communities into sustainable and resilient ecosystems that are productive of good health. And we know cannabis is the right tool to achieve this, right? Because we see beyond medical or adult use to a plant species that provides seemingly endless root solutions to healing our environments, our economy, and our social infrastructures, in addition to treating our bodies. Through its 50,000 agricultural, industrial, medical, and nutritional uses, cannabis innovations can and really ought to be wielded for health equity. From repleting our soil to saving our forests, to building our homes, to producing clean energy, to making medicine, and in doing so, creating an explosion of job opportunities for our people. Cannabis is the currency of investment in human, environmental, social, and economic well-being. And impacted communities and the individuals targeted within them should be the first to benefit, right? That's restitution, righting the systemic socio-ecological harms of the war on drugs, and should be the number one reason why we decriminalize, legalize, and regulate the economy of cannabis, followed very closely by its incredible medical potential to treat our chronically ill and aging populations, right? This is functional and holistic healthcare, treating illness at its root cause. And while revitalization must begin in impacted communities, the implications of this regenerative movement, so to speak, here is of global scale. That's why I have the globe. But in large part, we need legislation to do some heavy lifting to establish regulatory frameworks that facilitate these possibilities instead of blocking them. So what can we do? We can take action, right? We health and medical professionals are key stakeholders too, and share a responsibility to leverage our influence and wisdom to hold other stakeholders accountable to ensuring that institutional medical policies and that state regulatory frameworks and economies and tax structures and the medical and other innovations of cannabis actually serve health equity and positively impact our patients. By virtue of being here today, we are all taking action, but I have a few steps outlined here for reference. I guess we advanced a little bit, but get knowledge. We have to learn endocannabinology and cannabinology. We have to advocate. We have to participate in cannabis reform and champion equitable policies.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. Our next presenter is Mr. Stanley Atkins II, a retired firefighter and paramedic. Mr. Atkins is currently the CEO of the Stanley Group, a business strategy and development firm. He is also a medical cannabis healthcare educator and founder of Cannamedic. A well-established advocate for increasing access to alternative wellness therapies, Mr. Atkins has assisted in the development of cannabis legislation and decriminalization ordinances throughout Georgia. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Atkins.
Thank you as well. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Morehouse School of Medicine and the SHLI for really convening today to put this presentation together. I feel that in order to advance cannabis as medicine, we need more open dialogue. We need more open forum discussions, unbiased discussions, because I feel oftentimes that there's an implicit bias that goes with cannabis as it refers to medicine. So now I'm going to start my presentation. Medical cannabis challenges and opportunities to accessing health and improving health equities for adults 65 and plus and vulnerable communities. So a little bit of background about me. My name is Stanley Atkins II. I am a native of Griffin, Georgia. I'm known as the Cannamedic in the cannabis space. I am a United States Navy veteran. I proudly served my country on 2 deployments, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. I returned home and spent the next 7.5 years as a Clayton County firefighter paramedic. While serving as a paramedic, I began to work part-time at Emory University Hospital back when we had the Ebola patients. And my first responder and emergency healthcare career was cut short due to illness in 2014, which led me into researching alternatives for therapies and wellness in regards to gastrointestinal complications. I was being seen at the Winship Center at Emory, and I started to research alternatives for healthcare. I realized that there's over 5 billion patients on the planet, and I cannot be the only patient that physicians are telling that their condition is idiopathic in nature, but yet they wanted to proceed with a semi-aggressive healthcare treatment. I began to educate myself on cannabis practices, healthcare, and medical cannabis programs locally as well as nationally and internationally. And it really pushed me into the healthcare advocacy work and framework here in the state of Georgia. I am a huge healthcare advocate at the state capitol in regards to mental health, opioid addiction, community access to responsibilities for programming, as well as HIV advocacy for treatment, research, and how all that ties into medical cannabis. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with lots of conferences across the country. I've been featured on several major media platforms and publications through my work in education and advocacy. I am a community leader. As I stated, I have participated in 3 harm reduction or criminal decriminalization ordinances here in the state of Georgia. I was a part of the city of Atlanta's decriminalization along with the city of South Fulton. And in spring of 2019, I assisted with the city of Macon's decriminalization efforts. I am the sitting Georgia chapter director of Minorities for Medical Marijuana. We are a 501c3 located in 28 states that push for cannabis equity and reform. Health equity. So when we talk about health equity, people ask me, what is health equity? Because I've had these conversations before. And health equity, often referred to as health disparity, means that everyone should have the fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And what are the factors that tie into health equity? What affects health equity? For populations in vulnerable communities, this could be access to food, the quality access to foods, access to healthcare, ongoing healthcare practices, having a primary physician, as well as socioeconomic effects. And how are these effects medically important for us? And the reason for that is poverty, as it was stated early, is a medical condition. If a person is in poverty or lives below the level of poverty, that often means that the quality of foods that they eat is subpar. We often refer to food deserts as a prime example in urban communities and rural communities, in which these families and these patients in these communities have lack of access to fresh foods, fresh vegetables. Most of the foods they come from the local convenience stores. They're high in fats, sugars, acids, and these are increasing comorbidities and disease processes. And we're seeing the effects in children as young as 10 years old who are now suffering from high blood pressure. And my biggest thing is, how can we create a culture of change in health equity? I feel that it has to be the conversation that's at the forefront. We talk about equality. Well, equality in healthcare would mean everybody has access to healthcare. Well, technically, I would say we have access to healthcare, but the quality of access to healthcare and the access to that healthcare, how is that designed for communities of color? It is up to clinical physicians, it is up to patients, it is up to advocates and legislators to all take a personable approach. I feel that the reason there is such a gap in health equity is because we have lost touch with the sense of compassion in healthcare in America. The 65 and plus community. Data from the US Census Bureau shows that there are about 76.4 million baby boomers in the United States. There were a total record of 76 million births in the United States from 1946 to 1964. And for people who may not know, this era is known as the baby booms. When you hear the term boomers or baby boomers, this is the patient demographic in which they're referencing. And these patients make up a significant portion of our public health policies and programs. The impact that this has, we know now from data that patients are living longer, which means the longer patients are living, that means more patients that are going to have to be treated within our primary public healthcare system, as well as privatized healthcare systems. Baby boomers becoming consumers. We're here today to discuss the 65 and plus demographic. And we've realized from data in states such as Florida, California, Massachusetts, that seniors are seeking alternative therapies in lieu of conventional therapy, alternative modalities in lieu of conventional therapies. And the reason for that, one of the chronic disease processes that we see that seniors are requesting assistance for is chronic pain. So if a patient is suffering from chronic pain, they're usually inserted into a pain management system, but oftentimes the adverse effects, I won't say the side effects, but the adverse effects from some of the medications that they're taking often diminish their quality of life via being muscle relaxers or opioids, medications of that nature. So in doing some open discussions and forums with some elderly patients, I've come across the general consensus that the average senior patient that consumes medical cannabis, they're not looking to get high, they're really just looking to get well. Now, for some of them, if they happen to get high in the process, that is okay for some of them, but the vast majority of them, they're just looking for therapeutic relief versus an intoxicating effect. And states such as Florida, they're seeing a significant rise in the senior population. You know, there's a common thing that says, hey, when you get older, you retire and move to Florida. Well, this increases the Florida patient demographic. Florida is really expanding their program, even with the inclusion of edibles. But this also creates barriers to accessing resources and education regarding medical cannabis for those patients. When we look at states that do allow for marketing, we allow for programming for consumers, most of that programming and that marketing is designed and driven towards the younger community, more so the 21 to 40 community, when the patients who need the information, the literature the most is oftentimes the senior community. So I feel that there needs to be a strong push for a resurgence of connectivity with the senior community and those senior patients. As you see here, common usage by patients 65 and plus, one of the most common is chronic pain, loss of appetite, cancer, Parkinson's disease, hospice, quality of life, and spasticity. This is important because these patients are often, as stated earlier, on 8 to 10 medications. And oftentimes this polypharmacy approach isn't connected through each of their treatment teams. They may see an endocrinologist, they may have their rheumatoid arthritis physician, then they may have their primary physician. And all of these don't communicate oftentimes with their mental health physician. So there needs to be a correlation of information for these patients. Vulnerable communities. This is very paramount to me, and it's a touchy subject because I have a vested interest in wanting to help vulnerable communities. As a firefighter paramedic, I ran over 20,000 911 calls in the metro Atlanta area, and I saw the impact of these on these social communities and how it affects their healthcare. Vulnerable populations are at risk, or communities that pose a higher risk factor for poor health. And these risk factors include, as I stated earlier, the socioeconomic factors, political and environmental resources. The factors contribute to the physical limitation due to illness, disabilities. And a good example of this is diabetes and renal failure within the Black community. We have the highest prevalence of patients in renal failure. If you go to a dialysis clinic, the general patient that you're going to see is going to be of African American descent. So there needs to be a focus in the 360 approach to healthcare, because cannabis is not the end all be all, but it could potentially be a viable resource in improving health equity for these vulnerable communities. Continue with the vulnerable communities. What are some of the contributing factors? For a lot of people, it's demographically biased, and it's also regional. So let's take, for instance, Michigan. We know there was a water crisis a few years ago in regards to lead being into the water. Now, we have to understand that it may not be the immediate impacts on the healthcare system, but the long-term effects on that healthcare system. We're seeing the youth, the elderly, the pregnant demographic. It affects all aspects of public health and all aspects of patients, because no one is immune to, in vulnerable communities, to disease processes, to depression, to mental health. We understand that these food deserts contribute to the nutrition or lack thereof quality nutrition for these pediatric patients. And another thing that's very important is education. Nothing is more important than the education that these patients receive or don't receive. And there is not a lot of educational resources in the vulnerable communities. Usually the only place that they can receive programming or resources or even literature oftentimes is at their public health department. And this needs to be addressed at the local, city, and state levels. Health equity reform, looks like this slide was a little off. Patient education, how can we ensure patient education, community education, physician education, caregiver education, social justice reform, and education reform? Patient education is my first and foremost priority when I entered this space, because I realized there was a lot of technical information, a lot of acronyms, and a lot of medical terminology. And the patients who needed this information oftentimes weren't susceptible to receiving it. So I made it my mission to take the most technical medical information and lay it out to the most lay person in a a digestible format. The community education. That's why I've held community meetings, hearings. I participated in town halls because we have to engage in the conversation. We have to promote physician education through CMUs and CEUs, as well as caregiver education when patients receive their card. And this all ties in social justice and education reform. Here is the call to action. It is up to us to create a culture of change within our communities. We know now that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. Ensuring health equity would take a transdisciplinary approach to improving the quality of life for affected persons. So that involves each and every person on this call. Each person has a level of participation and a level of engagement. It is up to us to take this approach, put all of our resources together to come up with solutions to help from the ground level to the executive level. And that concludes my presentation. Research data, which, as you stated earlier, the double-blind studies, paramount. Atlanta is the capital for HIV and infection rates in North America. And I feel that through cannabis and cannabinoid research, we could potentially become the research capital in regards to medical cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Our last presenter for this section on education and policy in communities of color is Ms. Jessica Gonzalez. Ms. Gonzalez is with the firm of Bresler, Amory, and Ross, with a practice in the areas of intellectual property and cannabis law. She's also outside general counsel for minorities for medical marijuana, and she serves on the state and federal policy committee for the Minority Cannabis Business Association. A public speaker and leader, an advocate for cannabis legislation and licensing, Ms. Gonzalez has been active in cannabis legislation in New Jersey. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez.
So hello, everybody. So my name is Jessica Gonzalez, and thank you so much for having me here. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Okay, perfect. So just a quick about me. So I am a cannabis and intellectual property attorney at a law firm in New Jersey called Bresler, Amory, and Ross. I am also outside general counsel for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. That is a national nonprofit that's currently 27 chapters across the United States, and they help out with education, providing resources, job fairs, really just providing a lot of resources for communities of color who were most harmed, and providing them with resources to help get involved in the industry, but also be successful in the industry. I'm also on the policy committee for the Minority Cannabis Business Association, where I've gotten a chance to really view policy across on a national basis. But I have focused a lot of my work both in New Jersey and starting to get a little bit more involved in New York as that starts to develop. I'm also a part of the Cannabis Advisory Group, where I chair the social equity part of it. And I'm this year, I was recently appointed as part of the Continuing Legal Education Committee for the International Cannabis Bar Association, as part of their equity efforts. And so throughout the year, I'm in charge of putting 3 to 4 continuing legal educations on equity policy and recommendations. And so our first one will actually be next week. And I will actually have Tashida, who will be coming up after me in the next panel, also presenting. So I presented at over 60 plus different events, from anything from intellectual property to social equity, startup challenges, just by the virtue of my job and where I stand at the unique intersection of business and policy and legal. I represent cannabis companies and brands from around the country. Same thing in the hemp and CBD space. So I've gotten to see a lot. And through a lot of my learning, my goal has always really been to help provide a lot of the education to my community based on what I've learned and based on what I've experienced, because of so many nuances I've had to face within the law when it comes to cannabis. And so just quick overview, I think we may have already seen this, but this is really a map of the United States, really showing where cannabis is legal and really where it's not. So we now have 15 states that have legalized adult use cannabis for consumption, 36 for medical cannabis, and 31 who have decriminalized. So there has been a numerous amount of states that have rolled back a lot of these prohibitionist laws. But the one thing that we did see in 2020 was we have 4 states legalized for adult use. And all 4 states did that through a ballot initiative, meaning they had the residents of those states go and vote for adult use cannabis. Here in New Jersey, 67% of New Jersey residents voted in favor of adult use cannabis, making it the most successful cannabis campaign in the country. And one of the other interesting facets about this is the fact that in 2020, cannabis was deemed a essential business, medical cannabis, right, along with grocery stores and gas stations. And that was pretty historic. And what it actually had was a very huge implication on the conversation now as we were approaching it. Because now it would be very difficult to, if you go to states and you go to legislators and you start to explain to them why this type of medicine is necessary, not just on the medical side, but on the adult use side, because regardless of, if you're consuming for as a patient or as a non-patient, it's still a medicinal product. So it would now be difficult to have the conversation that this is not actually medicinal if the United States had deemed it, and different states, I believe we had over 20 states deem it as an essential product. And so it just kind of goes to show you the shift that we're seeing, but that type of legislation and that type of attitude towards cannabis and deeming it an essential business really aids our conversation and our fight for equity when we're speaking and when we're advocating, both on the state level, but also, on the federal level. So the reason, Dr. Knox went over really why, it's important to get engaged, and, she really harped on the fact that it's important that we participate in this, right? And the same thing to why it's important to really get engaged into this conversation. This is one of the biggest reasons why, is because if we look at the national arrest rates, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, created a report in 2020, really analyzing trends for the past 8 years, from 2008 to 2018. And what they found was that despite the fact that all of these states are rolling back prohibitionist laws, the racial disparity in cannabis possession arrests have not improved since 2010, and that they actually do persist in states that have legalized both on the medicinal and the adult use side. So if we look at some of these numbers, 6.1 million arrests for cannabis possession and distribution. In 2018, the total amount of arrests for cannabis in the US was more than for all violent crimes combined. And on, in state levels, the majority of those are always Black or Latino. And actually on the federal level, 77% of federal cannabis arrests are Latino, because immigration is also Latino. So it's kind of, an easy way to really try to deport somebody just based on, them carrying a medicinal medicine. And so on average, on a national average, the ACLU did not analyze in the Latino just for the Black community, but on average, a Black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested than a white person, despite consuming at the exact same rates. And so what this report did was it showed cannabis arrests are still widespread. Racial disparity has not changed. Cannabis arrests decreased slightly after legalization, but not too much, but that we still don't have a really full understanding of the effect that this is having on communities of color. And so I kind of went a little bit deeper and took a narrow view into Georgia and to look at really what this, what the cannabis arrest rates are there. And so it has the 5th highest cannabis possession arrest in the country. And actually, what was interesting, what I found was that Pickens County in Georgia actually has the highest racial disparity in the United States for cannabis possession. So you are 97.22 times more likely to be arrested if you are Black in Pickens County. And so while national arrest rates have trended downwards, Georgia marijuana possession rates have actually increased almost 20% from 2010 to 2018. And all of these types of arrest rates and what we're seeing is really just a snapshot, right? It's just only a very small picture of what we're seeing really across the country in terms of treatment of communities of color when it comes to cannabis. And so part of what I have done really when not at my day job, but when I throw on my advocacy hat, was I actually advocated a lot in New Jersey. And so New Jersey has had a medical market since 2012, but it's not robust by any means. Lack of supply, very few operators, controlled really by a few select few who can dictate the supply and who in turn can dictate the price. And it's important because a lot of patients here in New Jersey cannot afford their medicine. They can't actually get to a dispensary, and the pandemic made it even worse because delivery was not allowed. And so now you had all of these dispensaries, and we only have about 12, and we have, a lot of people in our state who were unable to get an appointment, who were unable to get their medicine, right? And so it was important that we really try to get across adult use so that you don't have to be a patient, but if you need your medicine, you can go to a dispensary if you are over the age of 21. For a very long time, New Jersey made it very difficult to become a medical patient. You basically almost had to have the rarest disease possible to qualify. When Governor Murphy came in 2018, he expanded it. So to include PTSD, to include substance disorders, migraines, anxiety, so that it would really open the doors for more folks who have ailments and who need cannabis to relieve those ailments. However, it's still important that we take into consideration what it is like for communities of color who are not able to get access to their medicine and who are not able to get access into the industry at all. So when we talk about social equity, it's become, a big buzzword, in the industry, but the way that I look at it is basically, providing folks with the resources, if they want to enter into the cannabis space, to be able to do so, but also providing resources to communities that were impacted by cannabis prohibition that really, doesn't touch upon cannabis, right? So in terms of housing and education and health equity in the way the past two presenters have spoken about. And so I put this here, and especially this, that the racial disparity have not improved since 2010. And that's pretty, it's pretty shocking, just given the attitude that has been trending towards more a positive acceptance of cannabis. And so what does that entail, the movement for social equity here? It means automatic expungements and pardons. And I put the word automatic there on purpose because in a lot of states, to get your record expunged or to get a pardon is a very burdensome process. And you need to get an attorney and you need to contact with all these governing bodies. And it's really, really burdensome for the petitioner who really may not have the time, the funds, or the know how to do so. So automatic expungements is definitely extremely important. Then we have reinvestment in the communities most impacted. And once again, because a lot of times the conversation around social equity steers towards, well, how are we going to get these folks involved in the cannabis community if they want a license? But what if they don't? But they've still been affected by cannabis prohibition. So housing, education, job training, investment in local entrepreneurship as well. And then, of course, affordable and accessible medicine, including home grow. As Dr. Atkins just said, they're sometimes having these food deserts, and then there's also going to be these cannabis deserts because there's not enough dispensaries around. Here in New Jersey, like I said, there were folks who had to drive. It was about an hour and a half to 2 hours was the average travel time that it took for a patient to get to a dispensary. So imagine having to drive almost 4 hours in one day just to be able to obtain your medicine, and then have to pay a very high rate for it, both with taxes, but also the cost of it. And so it's important that we have affordable and accessible medicine. And that includes growing your own medicine, which New Jersey has not allowed. And New Jersey is one of the only states that has legalized now for adult use, but that has not allowed home grow. But we do have a bill that is currently pending that will allow it, but it's pretty new and not so sure how much traction we're going to get on that. And then, of course, there's the state cannabis licenses, right? And so right now, I think the most recent report stated that 81% of cannabis business owners in the country are white, less than 5% are Black, less than 5%, are Latino. And so when you look at who's incarcerated for cannabis possession and who owns these companies, you can very well see that there's a huge disparity. And so the folks that want to get involved in cannabis, the people, communities of color, specifically the Black and Latino communities that have really shouldered the burden of cannabis prohibition, should have the resources and the opportunity to be able to enter the cannabis industry if they want to. And the way that I look at it is creation of a formal social equity program, priority for those social equity applicants, access to capital, which we know and we've heard about is very difficult to come about. You can't just go to a bank and get your traditional loan. At the moment, it has to come from private investors. Funding for education, training, and technical support. When I've spoken to numerous advocates around the country, the number one thing that they tell me about why an equity program isn't working is the education is not right. The education is not adequate because they're not bringing on professionals to do so. And so the last thing is access to professional services. And obviously this is not, an exclusive or exhaustive list, but it's a really good start as to what we mean when we say social equity. And so how do we get there? I get these questions, all the time of, well, how do we talk to our legislators? How do we get there? And so, I was asked to present on my experience in New Jersey, and the presenters who are coming after me, Mary and Deshita, both are actually very key players who really helped in New Jersey to kind of push the message forward and amplify it on a national level. So we organized leaders from around the country to help me testify, because there are periods when legislation is put through for you to testify and present your comments or concerns, whether written or orally. So I organized leaders from around the country to help me with this. We wrote multiple opinion pieces. We prepared a joint letter with over 30 organizations listing, our demands, and we provided draft language, which is very important. So if you have a lawyer on your team who's able to do so, it's much easier to go to legislators and say, here's what we're looking for, as opposed to having them do it from scratch, because this is not what they do all day, every day. So this is what our demands were: establish a social equity excise fee, create a social equity applicant status, allocate a portion of tax revenue towards specific office designated for equity programming, remove or alter certain micro businesses, remove licensing caps, which we see in other states, and of course ensure that delivery, which is a very new license, at least relatively new, to have access to the supply chain. And so things that you can consider for newly legalized states or states that are really on the verge. This is kind of, a list of what we should be looking for, what we should be advocating, right? So it's not ideal to really stay on the sidelines and complain about what's going wrong. You really have to get involved and understand what you're looking at. So looking at the taxes and how they're allocated, where's it going? Who's overseeing it? Looking at social equity, what does it entail? Is there actually a social equity program? Who's included in that? Right? What types of programs are there dedicated for social equity applicants? Once again, expungements or pardons. Is it automatic, or is the burden on the petitioner to have to do so? Where are the funds coming from if it's not automatic? Home grow, once again, is it going to be limited to a household? Is it limited to individuals? Is there a caretaker model contemplated for this? Licensing as well. Is it a competitive or is it an open market? What types of licenses? How much are the costs going to be? Are there going to be funds and grants? And the one thing that is really important is also municipalities. How much discretion do they have? And can they enact their own endorsement requirements? Because that's going to change up the game a little bit. And I just wanted to provide this for you guys of just what are the type of things that you should be looking for? What is really important? And then the types of questions that you should be asking and having, starting opening those lines of communication with your legislators and hopefully finding a champion within your legislative government who can actually help push a lot of this forward. But I think this is a really good start on the types of topics that are really important. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. We have a few minutes for our panel to talk, and I have a few questions to start us off. All three of you emphasized the importance of education and provided some guidance in that area. But if someone was to walk up to you on the street and ask, what concrete action can I take today or this week to support cannabis, medical cannabis education, whether among healthcare providers or among a patient group or just the general population, what would you tell them? What concrete steps would you offer them? And I think, Ms. Gonzalez, you sort of spoke about that a little bit. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I get the question all the time, right? How do I start? How do I go out there? How do I advocate? What tools do I need? And I think that's one of the reasons, that we all do what we do, and that's why we're on here, is to help equip those folks with the tools necessary that they need to have these conversations. But I think, the first place is really make yourself known in the state. If it's not something that you're particularly comfortable doing, putting yourself out there, there's a lot of people out there in the country that you can call upon who can help you, you can bring in backup, kind of in a similar way, that I did. But talking to your legislators and making them known of what you want over and over and over again, because we have to remember, these legislators are dealing with hundreds of issues a day. Cannabis is not something that they're focused on day in and day out. So, but there are certain folks who do this every day. So we know more about what we want, the obstacles that we see, the opportunities that we see, more than they do. And so it's really up to us to give them that information and give them the tools to start putting this forth. But a lot of times I think folks expect to just kind of sit back and say, well, legislator, I sent you a letter, so you should be doing X, Y, and Z. But if the pressure is not on them, and if they don't hear from the constituents who voted for them that this is what they want, going to fall to the wayside. So there does need to be an immense amount of pressure, but it has to be a consistent amount of pressure. And what it takes is for folks to get into the arena. And I think a lot of times that can be one of the more uncomfortable parts of this.
Mr. Atkins or Dr. Knox?
Sure, I'll go next. I think Jessica is right, but I would suggest that even before that, the number one step is to get educated. And Jessica, I know you emphasize that in your segment. We have to be competent in cannabis, in the science, in the pharmacology, in the physiology that it works on the history, and have a unified understanding of health equity, of social equity, right? Before we go in and champion our cause. I can tell you, working in Oregon in this space as many years as I have, and for cannabis to have been legal for as long as it has, it's been incredible to witness really the lack of knowledge that unfortunately has impacted our regulatory framework, both for medical use and adult use. We have to take a step back and take the time to get educated. We need to know the history. We have to understand all of those statistics that both Stanley and Jessica shared before we're equipped to have the intellectual conversations that are really necessary to bring cannabis into perspective. Right now in Oregon, we're working to draft a new model bill to unify hemp and marijuana under cannabis, because everybody seems to be using both hemp, CBG, and marijuana-derived products as medicine. This means we need to rethink the entire landscape, rethink the entire framework. In my talk, I placed a lot of emphasis on the other cannabis innovations beyond medical products that we could be leveraging to solve for those socio-ecological gaps, right, that are also contributing to perpetuation of poverty and illness, et cetera. So how do we start to shape conversations around bringing in the right infrastructure, right, facilities and equipment, et cetera, to start to process hemp and marijuana into all these other things that at the end of the day will contribute to health equity? It always begins with education. We're never gonna move needles without it. Can't just jump in there and say, cannabis treats epilepsy, so I'm going to fight for it. No. We have to take a very measured approach. We have to understand why. How does it treat epilepsy? And have a better understanding of the very nature of the commercialized commodity that we're selling to people at the end of the day. Competency is key.
Mr. Atkins?
Great question. If someone approached me on the street, the first thing I would ask them is, if it went legal today, which side of the counter would you prefer to be on? I then would tell them to educate themselves on their current state, their current county and city's policies and programs. I get this question a lot amongst my travels, and I ask them, well, what are your current laws? Do you know them? Do you know where to find them? Help them find the laws. Before you can play in a game, any game, whether it's a card game or it's a pickup game of basketball, before you play or do anything, you want to read the rules first. So find out, what are the laws in your state? What is legal? What is illegal? Are there barriers that prevent felons from participating? And two, as you stated earlier, do the work, be present. The way I got involved was I realized that when I was following all the advocate pages, there was no one of color. I realized there was no one speaking for my community. And I decided to go down to the state capitol and insert myself. And so what I do is I invite people to my state capitol and we work on bills. I've worked on the medical cannabis bills here as well as the industrial hemp. And I would tell people to get involved. And the minute they engage with conversation with me, I always tell them, you're already involved, starting with this conversation.
Thank you. A quick question, Dr. Knox, some members of our audience were wondering where the academic program is going to be offered that you referenced in your earlier presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I ran out of time there, but I was getting to the last couple slides on the Association of Cannabis, Health Equity and Medicine, or ACHEM for short. Please check out our website, achemmed.org, because through that we're going to be offering Pivotal EDU is a course offering the foundations of cannabinoid medicine, as well as other series like Cannabis Grand Rounds and other ongoing continuing education. You can earn credits, but this education really is open to all health and medical providers, right? Folks who are licensed or students who are wanting to be licensed in health or medical professions. Because at the end of the day, patients are coming to us asking us questions, and we have to be equipped with the information, like I said, to have intellectual conversations with patients to discuss both risks and benefits and really guide folks in what we call appropriate use. So it's Pivotal EDU, but if you come through ACHEM, you can get a discount.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like to throw out one more question. If you could change one thing in the direction that medical cannabis policy is going at this time, what would that one thing be, and why is that of such importance? And Dr. Knox, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me would be for all of us to understand that cannabis is not medical or recreational. Cannabis, characteristically speaking, right, it is medicinal. It's a medicinal substance. It has a therapeutic potential. It just is. When it comes to use, we regulate it. We regulate medical access. We regulate adult access. But at the end of the day, the commodity is what it is, a medicinal substance. And I'm really encouraging, Oregon to take a new perspective and recognize that so long as adults are turning to an adult dispensary to access something for medical purposes, it is our job to ensure that we are selling high and consistent quality products. Hopefully products that one day we can determine are efficacious through research. And so, my goal and my recommendation, especially to states just thinking about legalizing the first time around with medical use, to set up a medical program that reflects the type of industry that you are automatically creating. You got to create that supply chain. What is that supply chain going to produce at the end of the day? That's what we care about. We care about high and consistent quality products, regardless of an adult's intended use, whether that's medical, personal, right, which could include spiritual or recreational, or for winding down at the end of the day. A lot of people are turning to cannabis and turning away from their wine, right? So what kind of industry are we building here? Are we building an industry for recreational purposes? Are we really attempting to create marketplaces that are productive of the safe products that we hope our patients choose to use, right? There's going to be always a retail market for cannabis, competing with the pharmaceutical cannabinoid drugs, competing with the home grow. So it is incumbent on legislators and regulators and industry operators to bring integrity into this space and start to use all the best of science and evidence to produce those products.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to give both Mr. Atkins and Ms. Gonzalez just a brief moment to give just a brief moment of what you would focus on. We are almost out of time, less than a minute.
I'll go next. I think we need to focus on transparency. There is a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of different groups doing some great work, but there's a lack of transparency and consistency amongst those groups. So for us, I would say to look up to the north, to Canada, look down to Mexico, but also look far east to Israel. We have to find these countries who are doing the innovative approaches to this healthcare management and find out how we can leverage their work and implement some of the effective strategies in America.
Ms. Gonzalez, do you have a last thought for us before we wrap up our section?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, one of the things that especially I see really here lacking in New Jersey is a lack of the inclusion of medical professionals in the conversation surrounding how legislation is going to be drafted, both on the medical and the adult use side. And so it seems to me that, there's a ton of lawyers and there's operators in the room, but I really rarely find medical professionals to really give their input. And when there are states who are now crafting, their commissions or their advisory boards, a lot of times we don't see any sort of mandate that one has to be, a medical professional. And for medicinal plants, it doesn't make too much sense to me. And so I think, especially on the regulatory level, where a lot of these states, are headed, mostly doing the state, not a municipal, is to ensure that there's a mandate that a medical professional be on such an advisory board or a commission, because what I've seen is it's lacking. And I feel that it's just a tremendous disservice to this industry to not have that know-how involved in the conversation.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate your time and sharing your insight with all of us today. Thank you.
Thank you as well.